Hello and welcome to the first lesson in the Advanced C# course here on Tuts Plus. Now, in my mind, this lesson is really more of a precursor to the other lessons that are going to be coming up in this course, mainly because I really don't think this topic is actually an advanced topic, but it's definitely something that I'm going to be using in each and every video throughout this course. And if you've never seen this or are unfamiliar with it, I don't want it to cloud the main points of the coming videos. Now, this particular topic that I'd like to cover is on implicit typing. I want to go over a little bit about what implicit typing is, how to use it, a few of the gotchas, and what it's really going to do for you over the long term of your development career. So let's go ahead and jump into some code and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So here we are in Visual Studio. I'm using the Professional Edition, but you could absolutely use any of the free Express editions that you can download from msdn.microsoft.com. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new project. So I'll select File, New Project. And I will make sure that C# is selected and Console Application. Now I'm going to leave the name as the default because I really don't care for this particular demonstration, and click OK. So now we have our console application and the boilerplate code that comes with it. So let's talk a little bit about implicit typing. But before we start, I'd like to show you a little bit about where we've come from. So let's say we were writing some code that had a little bit to do with us working with a person. We needed to define some either properties or some fields or just work with some of those characteristics of a person within our code. So the way we used to do that is we would define these characteristics by explicitly stating the types of the variables. So let's say we were working with a string that was a first name of our person and his first name was John. And then we needed to create another variable to house the last name, but let's say we didn't know what the last name was yet, so we just left it uninitialized, which I'm sure you are aware of. The compiler is going to look at this and say, well, I'm going to give it the default value of a string type, which just so happens to be null because it's a reference type. And we also needed to store a couple other aspects like age, so we'll say int age is equal to 15, and we created another integer that was old age, for lack of a better name. So we could do Control-Shift-B to build. This will build just fine, and we can go about our merry way. Several versions ago of the C# language, Microsoft introduced this concept of implicit typing, which really allowed us to utilize the compiler in Visual Studio to take a little bit of the explicit nature of creating variables and initializing them out of our hands. And the way that we were able to do this was with the introduction of the var keyword. So what I can do with the type part of the declaration and initialization of the first name variable is I can say that this is a var, which is really stating to the compiler, I would like to create a variable, not a variant, and we'll discuss the difference in just a moment, with a name of first name, and I want to initialize it to the string John. Now this is very important. We're going to come back to this in just a moment. So let's say we wanted to do the same thing with an integer. We don't have to be using strings in order to use the var keyword. We can use it for any types within the C# or within the .NET framework. So we could do it with age as well. So I could save this and build with Control-Shift-B, and once again, everything builds just fine. Now let's say, well, if I can do it for first name and age, well, I want to do it for last name too. So I'm going to say var, and I'm going to save and build, but this is going to fail. It's not going to build correctly, and the compiler is going to tell you that implicitly typed local variables must be initialized, and that is the first stumbling block in using the implicit typing functionality. In order for you to use the var keyword, you really have to couple the declaration of your variable with the initialization. And the reason we need to do that is because the compiler needs to be able to look at this initialization step and figure out the type of it for you, and then create this first name with that type. So because we're not initializing the last name variable, we can't use the var keyword. Now if we were to change this to say, well, his last name is Doe, now I'd be able to save this and build it, and everything will work just fine. And the same thing goes for this example for the integer type. We can save and build, and this is going to fail because we cannot use implicitly typed local variables without initializing them. So we'll initialize old age to be 115. Now we can save and build this, and everything will work just fine. And now if you wanted to verify that everything was good, you could definitely drop down a few lines and start typing in the first name variable, and you can check IntelliSense, and it's going to say that the local variable of first name is of type string. And the compiler was able to do this through this step of initialization here. And same with age and old age, we could do the same thing, that it's a local variable of integer type. Very nice. So now, as I alluded to before, var is merely telling the compiler that I want to create a variable. Now, if you've ever worked in some loosely typed languages or some scripting languages, you have probably heard of the concept of variants or something along those lines where you could create a variable in the beginning part of your code that, say, it was originally a string, and then you could jump down later in your code and be able to change that type dynamically down the road. So then you could say something like, not that it would make any sense, but you could say first name is equal to 10. Now in some languages this will work, but because C# is a strongly typed language, if I try to build this, because the first name variable was initialized and set as a string, that means throughout its lifetime or its scope, it will always be of string type. You cannot ever change its type. So when people first begin to learn about implicit typing, they mistake this as saying, well, I thought C# was a strongly typed language. How can I create a loosely typed variable using the var keyword? And that's definitely a misconception, that var is not saying I want to create a loosely typed variable. It is merely telling the compiler I'm creating a variable and I want you to figure out what the type is based on the initialization step. So that's pretty cool. So I can use this var keyword anywhere where I create variables and initialize them in the same step. So I could do something like that in a for loop. I can say for var equal to 0, I less than 5, I plus plus, and then I could go ahead and write my normal for loop code in here, and everything will work just fine. So I could build this, and as you can see, it will work just fine. You can do the same thing with for each loops or while loops or do while loops or anywhere in your code that you couple that declaration with the initialization step. Now there's a couple gotchas that you have to pay attention to, and one of those that you are bound to run into is if you try to create some sort of variable, and let's just say I'm going to create a variable and we're going to call it test, which is very undescriptive, which you should definitely stay away from, which I'll cover in a moment. And I want to initialize it to something like null because I really don't know what it's going to be yet, but it'll be just fine. So if I try to build this, it's not going to work because the compiler is going to complain and say that you cannot assign a type of null or a value of null to an implicitly typed local variable. And if you really stop and think about that for a moment, it makes sense. So if I were to take a look at this line again, I want to create a variable called test, and I want to assign null to it. Well, what's this telling the compiler? It's saying, hey compiler, I want you to create a variable with a name of test, and I want you to initialize it to null. So what the compiler is going to attempt to do is look at the initialization step of null, of equals null, and try to deduce what the type is. And if you are familiar with C# language at all, or many other languages for that matter, null is a value that can be assigned to any reference type. And by reference type, I'm talking about the types where the memory is allocated for them on the heap. So in this case, there are literally hundreds and thousands of types, built-in types within the .NET framework that are reference types that you could assign null to, as well as who knows how many custom types you've created in your code. And because of that, the .NET framework and the compiler is not able to figure out what that type is. Now you can stick with this type of assignment, but you have to tell it explicitly. You have to help the compiler along a little bit. In this case, I could cast this directly to a string and assign that to our variable test, and now I could save and build this and it would work just fine. So I'm hoping that you're starting to see what the benefits of this are a little bit. Because I've been working with some fairly simple types so far, like strings and ints, you may not see why it's really benefiting you. I'm just swapping out 3 characters for 3 characters in the integer case, int to var, that's not really saving me much. And string, I'm maybe saving 3 keystrokes there. What's the big deal? Well, I agree with you in those cases, but I work a lot with a lot of larger types, larger named types within the .NET framework, as well as a lot of my own custom code. So I work a lot with string builders quite often, which is kind of a long name for a type, and I've gotten so used to doing it that now I can just bang out the code very simply in a line by saying var sb equal to new string builder, and I'm done. And I don't have to worry about typing string builder twice or having the encode complete to spell it out for me. I can simply say var sb and assign it a new string builder. Now you're probably looking at this, and I'm going to jump in and try to beat you to the punch where, yes, this is not a very well named variable. So one thing you really have to pay attention to when you're using implicit typing is it will definitely benefit you in the long run if you are very careful and do a very good job of naming your variables in such a way where you yourself and other people reading your code can deduce what they are. So SB is probably not a very good variable name. I would probably do something like string builder, or I would give it a name that would allow somebody to really know what its purpose is, so that they could once again be able to figure out what that type is. And please don't listen to those people out there that are going to say, well, don't use the var keyword because it's just laziness. I can't disagree with that more. I think this was definitely something that was put into the language for a reason, and if you use it in the correct way, following some of these best practices of how to initialize them and how to name these variables in such a way that you can understand what these types are that are being implicitly defined by the compiler behind the scenes, I think it's absolutely not a big deal and you're not going to run into any problems. So I hope you've kind of found this to be interesting. I hope you will use this going forward, because I'm definitely going to be using this in a lot of the lessons. So definitely use this in your code in the future because it's really cool. It's a really nice feature. It's very handy, and it will save you a lot of keystrokes in the long term. So now that we've got that under our belt, let's jump into some of the meat of this course, and I will see you in the next lesson.